Are there any studies that have shown that certain people are just wired to be more sensitive from an early age? And this is an excellent question because there are a lot of studies showing a sensitivity to, and I'm assuming that this is development of pain, more sensitive to developing pain from an early age. So I'm going to go into this a bit. I will send out review articles with the materials from this meetup afterward, so you'll be able to read it to yourself. And also I want to be very careful in how I approach this, because one of my really deep convictions is that whatever has happened in the past, whatever memories you have stored in your body, you can heal them. These are not things you're stuck with. It just takes sort of a courage to face them, which is not an easy thing to ask, because these are often memories that we have been afraid of looking at for years and years and years. And just the avoiding them for so long also creates a larger fear memory, because it's the fear of looking at it may even be more fearful than the actual memory itself. So I want to approach this topic very carefully and as sensitively as possible, because I think that there are always opportunities to change these patterns. We're not stuck with any trauma. So let's look at this from a few different directions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly talk about 3 different review articles. In each of these review articles, they have lots of different studies that were described, but I've extracted some major themes from each so that it'll be a bit more manageable to discuss. The first study is review study from 2016 is by Burke and colleagues. Psychological stress in early life is a predisposing factor for development of chronic pain. So this is a very clinically oriented article. If we were to go into the animal studies, there's a big animal literature, but I'm sticking mostly to studies done in humans here. In the literature, there seem to be 2 major diagnoses that appear to be more related to early adverse childhood events. And by adverse childhood events, I mean neglect, emotional or physical abuse or sexual abuse, poverty, and familial separation or parental death. These are all considered early adverse life events. With that said, I think that there are always patterns that we have whenever we're younger that were experienced as traumatic. So whether you experienced more severe early childhood events, or you experienced the childhood events you did have as quite severe, there's no value difference. Everyone has felt pain. We're all working to heal. So I don't want anyone to judge like, oh, I didn't really have it that bad. It's how you perceive things whenever you're a child that matters. So one of the diagnoses that's often associated with early childhood events is irritable bowel syndrome. The other is fibromyalgia or chronic widespread pain. Although this has been slowly explored in other populations, these are the populations that were explored first. So this also means that this is also a little bit of a bias toward what researchers were most interested in first. For instance, researchers who work with people with fibromyalgia were more likely to hear potentially about traumatic early events, and that's why they did the research in those populations first. So, for example, and I know this group, Gupta's group, this is an excellent study. People with IBS who experienced more early lifehood events compared to people who did not, they had a control group, showed more baseline activity in the salience and attention brain network. I'll explain this in a little bit more detail throughout the next few slides, but what this means is that they are on alert in normal life. They're on high alert. So a clinical correlate of this is hypervigilance and a little bit of stress reactivity. You're a little bit on edge. Even if nothing is happening, you're more on edge. You're more likely to be hypervigilant because things have been really stressful in the past. They might get stressful again in the future, and you're ready for it. So this is a protective response. This is not a maladaptive or a pathological response. This is an adaptive response that's been so strong in protecting the person that it's lasted through adulthood. So I think it's important also to honor the fact that whenever you have a very tough early childhood life, the body and the nervous system adapt to protect, and this protection should be honored. However, it doesn't still need to be there. So whenever we get to situations like this, acknowledging the protective mechanisms is important, honoring them, honoring why they were there, and then realizing that they aren't needed anymore. This is a more helpful way to think about this. And childhood adversity is also associated with altered structure and function of certain brain regions that we'll discuss in a bit, and changes in stress reactivity. So this has been explored quite a bit. The reason why I bring this up is that in this way, is that the way the brain works, the way the brain is structured has changed in relation to the early experiences, which means that any neuroplastic approaches that work with brain learning can change the memory structures that are underlying the changes described here. So neuroplasticity is, I've said in previous meetups, your brain cares about what just happened and what's about to happen. You always have the ability to change the function and the structure of your brain. You can change the function of your brain just by having a new thought. You can change the structure of your brain by having lots of new thoughts in a certain, in a certain habitual way. You can start to change white matter, which is how the neurons are connected within a few weeks. You can change the brain region anatomy, how many neurons are in certain areas within a few months. You have the power to change everything I've described here. So there's nothing set in stone. I also want to extend this discussion to early pain experiences. So there's an excellent, it's just an excellent review about people who, children who have had early painful experiences. For instance, if they were born prematurely, there are lots of painful experiences, injection injuries, but even just if, for instance, a person is born prematurely, a lot of the procedures that they undergo are painful, would actually be painful if an adult were to experience them. So for instance, a lot of preemie babies get repeated injections with needles. One could also argue that repeated vaccinations are also repeated injuries that could be encoded as painful. And I'm not saying that from any political standpoint, it's just an actual experimental assay that people use to study pain perception are needle stick injury or needle stick experiences. But what we learn from this is that whenever you have physical early experiences with physical pain, this could be surgery, this could just be handling, this could be injections from a very, very early age, there is quite decent evidence, even by the time they hit adolescence, they're more likely to express physical symptoms, including pain. So there's been a very careful literature documenting this. And whenever you look at this in relation to the animal literature, what you see is that these very, very early life experiences with physical pain create strengthened circuits in the limbic system, including the hippocampus, amygdala, and thalamus, and the basal ganglia. And the reason why I bring this up is this exactly what our research has shown is heavily recruited during emotional chronic pain. So in a sense, people with early painful life experiences, even physical painful life experiences, and this could be extended to physical abuse, for example, or painful sexual abuse as a child. The reaction of the nervous system is to increase its ability to learn emotions as a protective response. Again, it's priming the brain for emotional learning as a protective response. And what happens whenever this continues throughout adult life is it means that someone is potentially more vulnerable for depression, anxiety, and chronic pain, yes, but what it means is that they're a very good emotional learner. Their brains are much more sensitive to negative emotional cues because it has always been relevant in their lives. So there's no judgment here. It's an adaptive protective response. And what this means is that were these people who've experienced this to also be given positive emotional experiences, they'll learn those faster than someone with no abuse history or no pain history. So it works both ways. Whenever you have a strong emotional learning system, you can learn negative things more easily and you can learn positive things more easily. So the last thing I want to go through, and this breaks it down into a little bit, in a sense, gives some reasons why. This mostly focused on fibromyalgia populations. Early childhood physical and sexual abuse and neglect is associated with greater pain symptoms and pain-related conditions such as fibromyalgia in adulthood. And longitudinal studies suggest that court-documented abuse also increases risk of disabling pain symptoms after age 30. Whenever they look at the physiological changes that happen, there are two things that seem to stand out. One is a chronic stress response, which makes sense. Again, that's an adaptive behavior. Early life was stressful, so let's keep up the stress response to deal with it, whatever else is coming in that's new. And also chronic inflammation. And these things aren't mutually exclusive because inflammation can be perpetuated by chronic stress. Whenever we look at how this psychologically manifests, there are a few things that seem to stand out. One is catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is a combination, as these studies assess it, there are three dimensions of catastrophizing. Someone who catastrophizes is someone who feels helpless. They're more likely to ruminate or to think in looping thoughts like you just sort of can't stop. It's sort of an anxiety-driven loop of negative thoughts. And the third is magnification of negative thoughts. So a negative thought feels like it's massive and it's insurmountable. The power of knowing that is that if, for instance, you've had a history of abuse, or even if you've experienced early life events as traumatic, what that means is you may be more likely to feel helpless whenever you're thinking about anxiety and fear. You're more likely to ruminate and you're more likely to magnify the intensity of this, which means you now have a recipe of what to work on. Empowerment to contradict the helplessness. Recognition that what you felt as a child, you didn't deserve that and you deserved love. And even by making that recognition, that's a form of empowerment. So both empowerment, thinking back on the memories, and also on how you feel now. The other thing, rumination. What that is a sign of is a strong learning response. So working on curbing these negative thought loops. What can you do to shift your attention away? So with negative thought loops, there are two things here. One of the keys is being able to shift your attention away from the anxiety or the fear thought, which is a type of attention. And the other skill is being able to keep your attention there and not return back to the anxiety or the fear thought. So this is one of the reasons why, in the biotypes that we discussed before, flexible attention is so important. Where you place your attention is very important because that determines what you're focusing on, where your awareness is, where your energy is. And you have power over that. And it is a skill. It's a skill of shifting and staying on the thing you want to focus on more. It'll take practice, but it's a learnable skill. And if we, go back to a couple of slides before that mentioned how heightened the attention brain network is, this reinforces the importance of attention. You may be naturally drawn to cues that suggest threat or danger. And whenever you notice yourself doing that, drawing your attention back to a safety cue or to how relaxed your body feels, or looking around yourself and saying, okay, I feel that danger, but right now I'm okay. And finding different ways to draw your attention away from the fear or the anxiety. And the final one is magnification, which is whenever the negative, the fear thought or the anxiety thought feels massive, it feels insurmountable. And this will be something that requires a bit more cognitive restructuring or reframing, but thinking back, okay, this feels really powerful. In the past, in similar situations, I've been okay though. And right now, I'm safe. If that were to happen, I could do X, Y, Z. I could, make some plans to reduce the severity of it, for example. You can start to think about, because the guts of magnified negative thoughts are not seeing it's a type of black and white thinking. You're not acknowledging the shades of gray around the situation. It's going to be bad, and it's going to be as bad as it possibly can get. So you can work with that kind of bias by purposefully brainstorming things that contradict how big that bias feels, and then focusing on those alternative ways of looking at it, feeling into it, feeling how it could be real, imagining what it would feel like for that to be less scary than you thought, or what else could happen that would be a positive outcome, for example. So, these psychological factors, there's always an antidote. And usually whenever you find something, you look at its reverse, and that's the way that you treat it. So by looking at and actually what I can do, because I see a lot of people nodding and this seems to be resonating with a lot of people, I'll create a exercise that we'll hand out afterward about different ways to counter these psychological factors I list at the bottom here. So the other thing here is pain avoidance and also trauma experiential avoidance. You notice a theme here. Avoiding the feared thing makes the fear bigger. So this is specific to people with a history of trauma, but I think this is applicable to many people with pain. Avoiding the thing makes the fear of it greater. What is the antidote to that? Exploration, pacing, testing your limits very gently, very safely, delving into a little bit of an older memory, even if you don't go into the whole thing, delving into it a little bit. And if that doesn't feel safe, it's fine, but noticing whenever you're avoiding it is the first step. So even if you don't even feel ready to go into trauma at all, just noticing whenever you are avoiding cues, just gently, like, okay, I seem to be, that reminds me of something that happened whenever I was smaller. I'm just noticing it. That's interesting that I'm now seeing a pattern that happened whenever I was younger, and it's still a pattern today. Okay, interesting. And then it ends. You can do that too. And the other thing here is pain hypervigilance, which again feeds into the strong attention. And in a sense, you could say that someone with this background, and I could say almost everyone has something in our childhoods that we felt was traumatic. So this isn't just a certain set of people. A fear of going toward the pain and a constant lookout for signs of danger. signs that it could be getting worse. These are all things that we can target. So for example, for pain hypervigilance, whenever you notice yourself honing in on a threat cue, stepping back, going back to some sort of, softening, calming in your body. You can even just do deep breathing, noticing that you've honed into a threat cue. So even just noticing is the first step. Second step is to get a bit of a detachment from it. And third step is to look for some way to self-soothe. And although I will send this out whenever we just, I'll send this out later. I'll also go back to this slide in terms of, so these steps were originally developed for OCD, but this is a really good framework whenever you are coming up against a thought that is a fearful thought, an anxiety thought. The steps that seem to work really, really well. First, noticing it, identifying it, that's the first step. And you can just go through this as many steps as you can tolerate. So even if you just notice, this is a negative thought. I don't really like this. That's the first step. The second step is to reattribute, to detach yourself from the thought. And something I always like to bring up here is that if a message has come from you, from your higher self, from your internal guidance, your self only speaks to you with loving words and acceptance. And usually negative words and negative messages have come from other people, which is why I think of them as echoes. They're literally echoes of something we've heard or something we've interpreted that we've kept, and we internalized it as ourselves. So whatever the thought is, this is not me. So you're disengaging. It is not my thought. I have a negative thought in my head. I am separate from this thought. And, for instance, if you have a spiritual side, or if you communicate with God or your higher self, you could also say, this isn't my higher knowledge talking to me. This is not me. This is non-me. So just separate it as me or not me. If it is not me, then you know how to deal with it. Then you refocus. Again, you disengage your attention from this negative thought or fearful thought. You can do that by moving your body, by taking a walk, by deep breathing, by listening to music. Take your attention, your sacred attention, and you shift it. And that gives you a bit of a break. It stops your stress response from kicking in and starting to balloon up and to take over your whole nervous system. It stops that. So now you've created space between yourself and the thought. You've created space between yourself and the reaction. And whenever you're ready, it could be a few minutes, it could be a few hours, it could be a few days. Then you look back and you reflect on the pattern and you make a decision. It could just be noticing the pattern is affecting you still. That's fine. It could eventually be saying, I'm really tired of this pattern and I'm ready to change it. That's okay too. It could be, this pattern was never mine to begin with. This pattern belonged to someone else. And I know exactly who gave me that pattern, and that was them, that isn't me. Or this pattern protected me for a really long time, and I'm really grateful that it was there for me, but I no longer need it. So, the reevaluation is completely up to where you are, and it can change over time. And then there's a added step I'd like to suggest of just requesting help. So talking to someone about the pattern, or reaching out to friends or family, or someone you trust, a psychologist, a coach, higher self, God, whoever, in a sense, just having an opportunity to reflect about it and asking for help if you feel like that's resonant with you can be supportive as well. And this can happen many, 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 many times. So again, this is one of those cycles where this is one of the most used tools in my personal toolbox. It never gets old because it's always very, very useful. But what you'll notice over time is that it becomes easier. And you'll also find different ways to do each of these steps that's just perfect for you. That just really makes sense. Like, you know, Brian in the past has mentioned just the taking walks and letting your head clear and just thinking is really useful for you. So that's, you know, that could be part of your refocus ritual, or it probably already is. So something most important to remember for this is that none of these patterns, these are patterns that are deeply imprinted in your nervous system, that's true, but they don't have to stay there. And what you will notice is whenever you start to unravel them, you may feel some physical symptoms as they unravel. And this is good. This is whenever you have a pattern stored in your nervous system for decades, it's not going to go without some sort of physical symptom or some sort of sensation or some sort of emotion, because you're releasing something that's been held for a really long time. So also you may notice there'll be some situations where you go through this process and then you feel like almost like a reverberation, like your nervous system is resetting for a while. Maybe you'll need, if you go through something super, super heavy, you'll need extra sleep for a few days. Or maybe you'll notice an increase in symptoms. That doesn't mean that things are getting worse. It means that you've just released a big filter that you've placed over your reality, and you've peeled that away, and your nervous system is now recalibrating to a new reality where you don't live with that pattern anymore. So that can also be a cause for a reason why there are certain symptoms that come up.